A very early good morning to you, which I think is the time that it is. We'll be getting started in just a bit. Alright, I'm going to jump in here actually because it is a very strange hour and I don't expect a whole lot of people are going to have alerts on and also be up for a live stream at this strange hour. But I want to say hi to everybody because it's been a while. So, what have you been up to for the past few weeks? I've been really working hard on taking care of my family because unfortunately my wife fell off the porch. And so been taking care of her, but I haven't stopped looking at RPGs, and I want to show you 3 OSR games that I've been looking at. I'm gonna get hung out to dry because these games, some people are gonna take issue with my characterization of them as an OSR, you might say. But you know, that's me. I've got hot takes, and occasionally I provoke anger with them. So if you're excited for this and you want to do a flip through, then let's get going. And I should take off this stupid headset because it's broken and I don't need to hear anything right now. So see you in a minute. So what are these 3 games that we're looking at tonight? The first is Astonishing, Swordsmen, and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, which is an AD&D-derived game. Really, it is AD&D, and we'll look at what the subtle differences are, but I think that it's a really great introduction to the AD&D fork of Dungeons and Dragons, because for way too long, in my view, the OSR has really been all about BX-derived games. And that's kind of been the heart and soul of it, and even white box games. Well, this is the other side of the coin, and I think it's criminally underreported that it's just a really good emblem of what's coming out. The people associated with it are pretty good people. I don't know a ton about Jeffrey Talanian and Northwind Adventures, but I do know that this is a great book if you want to introduce people to old school gaming, because it's really readable and it's big and it's got tons of art, and we will be looking at it. The next of these games is Against the DarkMaster, which is MERP and Rolemaster inspired. At first I thought this was really just kind of a nostalgia game for products from Iron Crown Enterprises, which was a crunchy game maker that held the license for Middle Earth products back in the 80s and 90s. You may not know this about me, but my first introduction to tabletop role-playing games, after I kind of got too embarrassed by the Satanic Panic and I threw my rules cyclopedia into a discreet garbage can at some point in my life, to my shame and regret. In any case, I was very lucky because ICE accidentally sent me a copy of the Rolemaster box set when I was about 10. And so, you know, I really looked with really googly eyeballs at this game when it was first announced, Against the DarkMaster. And I want to show it to you, and I want you to see that it's more than meets the eye, and it really reaches beyond the source material to be its own really exciting thing. And this is what nobody's talking about with this game. And so that's what we will be doing, is highlighting how I think it's really exceptional. And the third of these games is really going to cause a stir, I think, for folks, because I'm calling it an OSR, and I'm sure somebody's going to hang me out for that, which is Aces and Eights Reloaded. It's basically the same game as when it was first released in 2008, with upgraded graphic design and slightly more sensical formatting choices. It's really a brilliant, no frills take on an Old West RPG. Now, I mean no frills as in there's no frills in the setting. There's no science fiction elements. There's no fantasy elements. The alternate history that it presents is very scant as far as how many changes are made, how many liberties it takes to bring you an Old West RPG. And it's got some exceptional things about it. Mechanically, as far as how it handles gunfighting, which I think you may be interested to see, but most people have probably heard about that. I've got a deeper take, which I'm still developing, about the kind of characters that it creates, and this is going to be interesting to look at that one. If this is a stream that does well, if this is a video that you're interested in, I may do more of these because the whole production chain right now, as far as how are things going in my life and my house, is such that, filming the video and editing it and getting it all together and pushing it out the door and being really tight with it is it's a tough thing right now for me. So without further ado, let's jump into this. Let's look at Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea. So this is a game which is based on Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It's got an entirely different take on the art style, which is much more grounded in weird fantasy. It is drawing upon the Appendix N roots of the game, and it does make some changes to what is in the book, but not the rules themselves, really, per se. There's little tweaks, which I'm sure, I'll get hung out for, that folks will say I shouldn't be overgeneralizing, that this is basically first edition AD&D. Because one thing that makes it not just basically first edition AD&D is it doesn't have the Gary voice. It is presented in a voice that makes learning and teaching you more of its priority, and something which it cares to do. And that, I think, is somewhat exceptional versus, the edition of 1981. This isn't pedantic, it's not preachy, and it's not really giving a lot of hot advice to dungeon masters about how to avoid getting their game ruined. Instead, it's really prioritizing teaching advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So here you have it. Of course, each of the attributes has their little sub-scores and how they modify your character, which should be pretty familiar. And this is not very changed, but there is a good deal of fat that's been trimmed. If you take note of that, I welcome that. They're trying to make these things matter a little bit more, and the little shades that come with these scores feel different. So if you happen to drink some strange water in a dungeon and your intelligence goes up by 1 point, it might be something to be excited about. Or if it's the converse and you've lost a point of intelligence, it's something meaningful. And so making those ability scores matter beyond just ability checks is something which Advanced Dungeons and Dragons has, I think, more than BX. It's one of the places where I feel excited about rolling up a character, and I look at the character sheet and I know what it means in mechanics, it means for gameplay. And I think that's pretty exciting for my part, and that's what sets AD&D games apart. So one of the big changes from its source material, of course, is that it has a collection of classes that you might not be familiar with. Some of them are very much inspired by the Unearthed Arcana classes and things that were part of the AD&D ecosystem back in the day, things which I regard as part of the heart and soul of that AD&D first edition game, because they appeared very highly in the Hackmaster 4th edition material, which is kind of my OSR wheelhouse. This is where I've spent the most flight hours in the cockpit's chair, in the GM's chair of any RPG, is with this game. And so when I think about OSR, these things are pretty welcome. There's a magician, and there's also a witch. There's also subclasses for each of these. And that's one of the things, is that it brings in a symmetry to which classes have subclasses and what sort of subclasses they have, that is maybe a surprise. So the cleric has a couple of subclasses. As the ranger is a subclass of fire, and so on. And so this is a welcome place that I think it really feels fun. And there's a remix to kind of the way that magic behaves as far as what it looks at as fundamental. So instead of the classic schools of magic and the illusionist being core, here we see a subclass which is based on ice magic, which of course, again, something which I'm familiar with from Hackmaster 4th edition, but is normally not something you'd be seeing in the core book. One of the big changes, though, in when it comes to uh, Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, that I think is really notable and important, is to say that it leaves out all of the other fantasy species. So there's no elves and no dwarves because it does present a setting which is kind of based in the Conan the Barbarian and the weird fantasy bedrock, which doesn't usually have those things. So it's not appealing to Tolkien. Instead, it's appealing to the sorts of stuff that Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax and Tom Moldvay and company were reading and digesting and turning into Dungeons and Dragons. So that's what it wants to present to you and give you as a foundation. And it has its own setting of Hyperborea, which all of its very good adventures are set in. Um, and I think that's fine, frankly. Um, if you want to use different species in your game of Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, I don't think there's anything stopping you. One thing I will say is that those omissions from the core rulebook leave you more able to develop a unique setting. And you also have more tools to do so because there's all these really interesting classes which are right there in front of you. And you don't need to write up a really special campaign document. And a welcome and interesting thing here is the monk is a subclass of the cleric. Something which I think maybe fits a little bit more with the assumed settings of D&D. And this is the sort of thing that it really it tries to do is it wants its setting and its mechanical bedrock as much as it's willing to make little adjustments to match one another. And I think that's a not only a laudable goal, but it makes it much easier to take in for folks who are new to OSR gaming. Is that this makes no sense, or I can't tell what it's really about. Those are complaints that I've heard from folks, and they're maybe not wrong. There's a really concise and really good monster manual, which is included in the game. And perhaps most notably for me, and I think is a really meaningful part of this, is that all of the different sections, which were Gary-isms like this underwater combat and so on, they're written very clearly and they're written with a meaningful eye towards explaining how to execute this procedure as opposed to here's some stuff that I had lying around the office which ended up in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I don't want to dig too much on how the first edition AD&D is laid out, but it can be hard to find information in those books, frankly. And on contrast, the information in this game is just there, and it's really easy to find because each of the different areas, like for example, treasure, is in its own appendix, which is really easy to find and has some meaningful art which helps my eyeballs and my mnemonics remember where things are. Is the art amazing? I mean, it's black and white, and I always liked that style. But for me, the really important thing is that it's easy to find stuff. And also, the descriptions of the spells are very consistent. The spells in the AD&D era, they came from a lot of different sources, and in some ways, AD&D was coming out of a phase that TSR was in where they were kind of making zines and competing against, frankly, zine-type publications from other folks like the Arduin Grimoire. And so a lot of stuff came from magazines and other places and kind of was just put into AD&D without a great deal of editing and without a great deal of like normalization and making all the text talk in the same voice. And in contrast, this is one of the really beautiful things about this game is ASSH speaks with one voice, and that makes it very consistent. And it's a good voice. Like I'm really ready to listen to the voice that it's speaking to me in. That's what I have to say about this game, folks. It's the AD&D that if you want to pick up old school AD&D in the year 2021, this is the best tool that we have to do that right now. If you're just looking for the basics of it. Of course, I do love my Hackmaster. I will never lie, but there's a lot of extra chrome, and it's not quite the OG. And so, until we get something which is a little different and inspired by second edition AD&D, but has its own voice and speaks with one voice with new graphic design, I'd love to see that game in the future. But for now, we have this awesome game called ASSH. And I think it's really underreported and it's undersold as far as how if you need an entry point to OSR, this is a great one. You don't have to play in Hyperborea, frankly. So let's look at Against the DarkMaster. This is a game that I'm excited to show you that I think is also kind of underreported and underrepresented as far as what it's really bringing to the table. This is the big deal, folks. Yes, it has really, tight art that is really, it's got an idea of what it wants to evoke. Yes, it has a really concise graphic design look that is really echoes a lot of the OSR as far as how there's not a ton on every page, but it's carefully put together. And the part of this is that I think there's been a lot of additional work done massaging the language because the authors are from Italy, and this English work the text is great, frankly, and I love how concise it is. It feels well written, and into the same similar level as 5th edition AD&D as far as how concise and legible and easy to read it is. But enough about that. I want to talk to you about, what it is that makes this game special, okay? They really hammer this home that it's got a lot of, intended setting. The big thing about it is that it's trying to nail down a genre, kind of a subgenre of fantasy, which is going against the Dark Lord fantasy. Now, you might think Lord of the Rings is the only iteration of that, but it turns out, like, if you think about it, there's tons of these games where there's a big bad guy who's trying to control the entire world. So the Witch of Narnia, for example, and let's think about this. Oh, David Bowie is the Goblin King of the Labyrinth. What else do we got? The King in Yellow is, frankly, and many of the elder gods of the Cthulhu mythos, if you put them into a fantasy context, they start to look a lot like if there were heroes that were trying to stop or face down or discover the sinister designs of this, powerful entity, which is really going to place the world in its grasp. That is a fantasy subgenre unto itself, and it's inviting you to make up your own DarkMaster and your own world that the heroes exist in. And, part of that is the idea that there are multiple different species which share the world together. That maybe as the ages are passing through myth into the future and towards a more mundane world, there are elder races and younger races like men, of course. That's one of the things that it's pleasantly, invites and it asks you to think about how you would remix it. One example of how this game differs from a lot of other games of its source material is that it does talk about how the characters' feelings and intensity can, that their moxie, like wanting it bad enough can change things, which is maybe a more modern RPG thing. But if you think about it in the terms of the genre, especially if you think about those moments in Lord of the Rings, that I am no man, and Eowyn takes off her helmet, and there's a certain assuredness that takes over, that grasps the reins of fate. How many moments there are in those films, especially as Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens had their hand upon those films, where it really is about characters making a real sea change decision to reject prophecy or to drive home at it. And those moments, I think that this game is affirmative to, which is a little bit different. And maybe you might think is a not quite so OSR-y. But as far as the aesthetic, as far as that it's rooted in the source material, and yes, mechanically it is using a D100, it's using a combat system, which is, it reminds people of MERP, but it's very simple. It doesn't have the table master aspects that you might be familiar with. And I think that's perhaps one of the places where it's going to likely find a larger audience and frankly a more ready audience than you might see were it closer to the Iron Crown games. But it has a good deal of nuance. For example, it has a number of different things that you can do with your turn in melee, which is perhaps a little unusual for OSR games, but nevertheless, it is deadly, which is something which more modern games don't deign to kind of look to. The real heart and soul of this, though, is with the DarkMaster. Is that you're invited to create a DarkMaster. You're invited to sow the seeds of this microgenre at your table, and kind of reinvent who the Fellowship of the Ring is. What is the Ring even? What sacred artifact might it be that is the undoing of the DarkMaster? How does it work? And it really drills down, and I love it for that, because it's really an invitation to do something which I don't think we've really realized is its own microgenre yet, especially within the hobby. And as far as yeah, we've played with dungeon masters that want to do that thing, and it feels tropey, and it feels repetitive, and it feels like, oh, really? But this game says, look at how much space there is in this microgenre. Look at how you can inhabit it, and your specific playthrough, your world, your rendition of it can be exciting. So I'm excited for Against the DarkMaster, and I think that it merits more talking about. And finally, this is the one that I'll catch some heat for. I think this is an OSR game that you need to see in the year 2021, and it's Aces and Eights. Its original rendition, it came out in like 2008 or so. Frankly, the graphic design was really rough on my eyeballs, and it was really hard for me to follow where things were, like how to move through the book and so on. It's ironic because I cut my teeth on this game, and this is made by the same people. It's got many of the same mechanics, but it was often hard for me to figure out what was going on. And to the au contraire, things are easy to do in Aces and Eights as far as navigating the process. So character creation is random, like it might be in Traveler, like it is in Hackmaster, as in you're rolling up your person who's in the Old West. One of the real things that they go out of their way to do, unlike in Hackmaster, is teach you how their system works in a really easy to understand way, as far as each step of the process of rolling up a character. Yes, it is involved. Yes, you do roll dice in a discrete way with an order, and those choices are sort of informed and form a formative part of your character's role-playing, just like it is in Traveler. And that's the fun of it. Now, one of the unique things is that this character creation system, it creates young people in the Old West. This is where it's not exactly divergent from its genre, but where it means something special in particular, apart from just it's a Western game. It creates people that are coming of age and have decided to go west. So you roll a die and you're between 15 and 22 years old. And you have some ambitions that you might think you can realize out in the Old West. And you're sort of scarred by some things in your past, and you might not fit into regular society. And so these are things that are holding you back, or that would hold you back if it wasn't the wide open frontier. And of course, I think it merits talking about as far as, it's 2021 and the West is, a social, uh, it's a topic which social issues might come up, and certain perspectives might say, that's problematic. I don't know that we can play a game in that setting any longer. And I want to talk to you about that, of course, and talk to you about how it does do a little bit of work to create a setting which I think is more comfortable, a little bit more comfortable to play in. That doesn't look away from the bad stuff, but also doesn't say like, your characters are going to preside over, you're going to be party to or very close to the action of, that saw the disappearance of an entire people, an indigenous people of North America. And frankly, it doesn't make me super excited to play a Western RPG set in the real world. Um, so you need to tweak it somehow. Um, but you need to preserve some of the bedrock of the Western genre, because it's about real people. It's about people who suffer from some of the same things as we do. The broken families, ambitions that are can't be fulfilled within the normal framework of life, and drug use. There's just people who got problems and go west. That's part of what makes Western stories exciting. And specifically, this says these are young people who have not been around the block 12 times. And you're discovering their tale, and perhaps you're kind of unfolding the tale of an entire town of the West, your little corner of it, in much the way that you might play Pendragon. This was something which was pointed out to me, and I should give due credit. I was talking to Runeslinger, who's getting ready to do some kind of game with aces and eights. I've learned, and we were chatting about how it creates young people, and it's what's up with that? What does that mean for the game, and how does that change it? Well, this is one of the ways it does. So we should talk about combat, okay? This is an important part of it, because it's got a interesting or a pretty different system. So it's got an initiative count system. Rather than you roll initiative and you take turns, each thing that you do consumes a given amount of time. And so that's a clock that's ticking ever forward. And so this is a lot like FASA Star Trek in some respects, but in many respects it's sort of um, like a real time tactical RPG inside of your computer as far as how it parses out time. Those could be turn based by ticks, but each thing that your character does takes a tick, and then we just move through this timeline. And anytime that you complete a thing, then you can choose to do a new thing. Is it a little out of the ordinary? Is it pretty granular? Yeah, it is. Do I find it to be this combat system in total to be considerably more interesting and less daunting to try and run at the table than GURPS? Yes. Now, so let's get to the really that's a bold statement for me to make. This is the shot clock. When you take aim at someone, you try and find a silhouette. You put this little transparency sheet, or in these days, you might put a PNG over another image, and then you draw a card from a deck. And how close you rolled to your target number is how close you are to the center. And the card determines which spoke upon the wheel your bullet lands. And so this is how characters get specific wounds. This is how you can very granularly say, like, I'm behind a wall, like, or I'm just leaning around the corner. So this half of my character, this half of the silhouette has some cover. It's granular. It's frankly if this game was all about combat, that might be quite a lot of water to carry, frankly, wouldn't it? But it's lethal, and this game has a lot of other things going on. And it's once upon a time in the West, but not just the gunfights. And so it has some mechanics, some subsystems for cattle drives, for bar brawls, and for different manner of things like that. And it has a reputation system which echoes that from Hackmaster in the form of honor. And so your character can have some goals, really. And that's what it is. Is you get these young people, and as they grow up, they can have goals, and that's part of how your character advances. Is that you getting to those bullet points on a goal ladder is how it happens, and it's kind of fun. I think that would I have chosen a different advancement system that was based more on passions and ambitions and drives, like we saw in the Darkmaster? Maybe. But frankly, I'm excited to try it out, and I definitely would tell you that it gives maybe a more casual player a beeline, something to aspire towards, as opposed to just pulling out their gun and getting killed quickly. It gives some good and stern guidance about, like, hey, if you want to get some building points, if you want to make your character better, and you want to get a star for doing your character good in the eyes of the rule book, then here's the things. And the things are stuff like staking a claim if you're a prospector, striking gold, you know, getting a mine going, and starting a saloon. The different parts that are things that are romanticized in the West. That a young person is there's a little part of their brain salivating for in 1870 something. And this is where we should talk about the setting, because I think it is an important point here. Okay, let's find that map. And I'm not going to talk about it a great deal. But the big thing is that history diverges in 1842. The West has less railway infrastructure by the time we get to that kind of core. It is the Old West date of 1876, which seems like most films kind of sort of, that is the old-timey, romanticized adventure West. And yes, that does include the fact that the Civil War does end in a truce, and there's a rump state of the Confederate States of America. Some people accuse this game of having a let me see, CSA Abu type take on history, because it obviously preserves a rump state of the CSA, but things are grim there. If you're familiar with the history, a ton of acreage got newly planted with cotton in Egypt and in India and elsewhere around the world. And so the demand for cotton and the supply, even after the Civil War, those huge monies basically pouring into the South of America at the expense of human lives, which were creating that wealth, it's just not worth as much. So they're driven to kind of even more sinister and worse behavior, and they're more bankrupt, even in their kind of truce, and they're bleeding territory from their western frontier, and it's by no means a good situation, and the game doesn't look away from the fact that there are people in bondage that are trying to escape, and in many cases get west. Would I like it if there was a little more moral outrage about that topic, or that characters were a little more motivated by that? Yeah, I mean, it's true. It is something which I think the game could do a little better, but it doesn't look away. And the other side of the coin, the less railway infrastructure, because of the historical divergence, gives us a really apt answer for why the Native American population, why the indigenous people of America are persisting and surviving in a way that in 1876 things didn't look so good. And in fact, that's not really a time that anybody who is a moral person should feel all that nostalgic for, given what was happening. So there's a historical divergence there. Another part of the game is that it's assumed that you're taking place. It's going to take place that your setting is going to be in this in the territory that Mexico never lost, kind of a deep periphery of Mexico, and of lawlessness, of kind of fusion of cultures between that the Latin American and the North American and the indigenous. It doesn't do a ton of world building, though. It doesn't, throw out a ton of new fantasy stuff because it assumes that you are a mature enough individual to study the history. Frankly, like this is how we came to a resolution of this, which is specifically we need to kind of keep the old westy time going for a little longer so that your characters can get old and grow up and have ambitions. So that means that the railways, they snuffed it out pretty quick in real life. And likewise, the railways provide the infrastructure and they really make a lot of people thirsty for land. And a lot of the more reprehensible parts of history come from that easy travel, which happened. And so the railways just are not developed in the 1876 of this game in the same way that they would be in real life. And I think that that's where the alternate history setting of Aces and Eights has its raison d'etre, and why it's worthwhile for it to present that. So, what can we talk about? Well, one of the things that has a really nice embedded sandbox, which, it's not where I would pick to set up a little sandbox, but the cool thing is that it shows you, like, you can set up a hex call, you can create a little nook of the West and remix it as much as you want because history is already 30 years divergent. So you can kind of use your own ideas. I've got my brain working on what it would mean to run this game in Westworld, the show, and that would mean playing as people who are not aware that they're artificial beings and so on. But I haven't figured it all out. But what I can tell you is that this game is, as far as 19th century Earth, this is it's got a rule set which is pretty compatible, and I think there's a number of other places where I might imagine running this game on in a fantasy, an alternate history, no frills, not a whole lot of aliens, not a whole lot of Cthulhu stuff, type of 19th century Earth, besides just the American West that it's presenting. And so it's got a lot of promise, and I think it's really underreported. Why is it, I think, an OSR? Because it's AD&D based, because you roll for your characters, because it's got strong lethality, because it has a lot of open-endedness about what the game's about, and because it really invites you to play in a sandboxy fashion with even a hex crawl of sorts, to include things like prospecting for gold and cattle drives. So these are the three OSRs that I think are really underreported and just have not gotten their time and been boosted. Maybe because they're a little bit crunchier and they've got some bigger rulebook. Or in the case of Against the DarkMaster, everybody thinks that it's really crunchy because it's hearkening to MERP and Rolemaster. But, honestly, it's a D100 combat system, but it's not super hard to figure out, and it's by no means is it anywhere near Rolemaster. So these are games that I think I might want to do a little bit more talking about in the coming months, as I'm got some family stuff going on, and it's harder for me to kind of do the whole video pipeline. So if that's something that you're interested in, if that's something you're up for, then I would love to share my explorations of these games and perhaps others with you here on the channel. I'm doing this as a live stream. I'm not going to turn it into an uploaded video because, for the moment, if there's a lot of great feedback on it, maybe I'll edit it down. But I'm thinking that live streams is a way to not kind of bleed my audience. by creating people who are bored or not interested in this narrower content. Because that's one of the issues, is that when I make narrow content, the algorithm sees that, oh, even your subscribers didn't want to, only 10% of your subscribers thought this was something they wanted to click on. Those are the consequences of making narrower content that's focused on a particular game and the rules of a particular game, and even a subtopic within that game, as opposed to like how to deal with boredom at your table, which, obviously we know there are hundreds of channels which are doing things like that out there in YouTube, and you're here because I think you might be here for something else. So I'm going to take a minute to look at chat, as I always do, and see how you're doing. Yes, I am still going, but I'm just about done now because it's been a fun little talk. So have a good night, everybody. And if you're watching this in the morning, then enjoy the video. Maybe the algorithm will show it to you. Take care.